This outstanding painting by New Zealand military artist Russell Clark captures the moment the New Zealand Navy vessel Kiwi rammed and ultimately sank Japanese sub I-1 with her sister ship Moa. It was the night of the 29th of January 1943, a little more than 2 years into the war in the Pacific. The Solomon Islands was the front line for the advancing Allies. On board the stricken Japanese submarine was a top-secret cargo, one that crucially fell into the hands of the United States Navy. This also remained a secret till after the war, to the crews of both New Zealand vessels, redesigned deep-sea trawlers. Unbeknownst to them, their bravery not only resulted in the death of Japan's most famous World War II general, it would shorten the war in the Pacific. The incredible parts the two vessels were to later play in World War II were almost over before a shot had been fired and a depth charge dropped. Like many countries, New Zealand was woefully ill-prepared at the start of World War II. Militarily and economically, Britain was stretched to breaking. The most pressing need at the outbreak of the war was to protect the country's waters and shipping lanes from the imminent threats posed by mine layers and submarines, and quickly. This led to the unique multi-purpose design 50-metre long naval trawlers known as bird class, minesweeper and submarine hunters, jack of all trades, master of none. Top speed a rip-snorting 11 knots in flat water. 3 such vessels were commissioned: the Kiwi, Moa and Tui. All were built in Scotland. The captain of the Kiwi, who was also in charge of getting the tiny flotilla back to New Zealand, was Gordon Bridson, a New Zealander who was already a veteran of the Royal Navy's battles with U-boats in the Atlantic. In the closing days of 1941, the New Zealand vessels tagged in behind an Atlantic convoy battling its way to North America via Canada, enduring engine problems and the worst recorded Atlantic hurricane of the last century, as well as ice accumulation that made the vessels unstable, and with bulkheads damaged, the tiny flotilla limped into Boston Harbour for repairs. The story of the 3 converted trawlers was oh so close to being cut short before it started. Ultimately, the 3 vessels made their way to Auckland, where they were quickly turned around and sent north to join the US Pacific Fleet in the waters surrounding the Solomon Islands. Let us take a look at the broad overview of the military situation in January 1943 as it relates to this story. The Allies were now in the ascendancy, island hopping towards Japan. US military might on the water and in the air made life tough for Japanese supply lines. Between the 14th of January to the 7th of February 1942, Japanese forces conducted Operation Key, the evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal. Such evacuations and resupply missions were undertaken at night to avoid Allied aircraft attacks. Destroyers and submarines were employed for these nighttime missions, owing to their speed and ability to elude both aircraft and surface ships. These missions were dubbed the Tokyo Express by the Allies and Rat Transport by the Japanese. One of the vessels seconded by the Japanese for resupply and redeployment was the submarine I-1. Her manifest consisted of food, landing barges, and more importantly, copies of the new reserve code books. Time to take a look at her. The I-1 was more than a match for the Moa and Kiwi, even on the surface. Larger than both vessels combined, the I-1 was 8 knots faster, and her main armament fired shells twice the size of both the Kiwi or the Moa. On the 29th of January, I-1 lay west of Honiara, close to an area controlled by the Japanese, awaiting darkness before making a subsurface journey into Kamimbo Bay at the northwest end of Guadalcanal. That night, the Kiwi and Moa were a mile apart, patrolling the bay. At 18:30, the Japanese sub surfaced directly in front of the Kiwi, captained by Gordon Bridson, who couldn't believe his luck, the submarine's phosphorescent outline making an easy target in the moonlight. 2 lots of 6 depth charts were dropped by the Kiwi, disabling the I-1's electric motors and forcing it to remain on the surface in the shallow waters. Switching to electric power, the I-1 tried to make a run for it, whilst the 2 vessels exchanged gunfire. On the deck of a submarine was the captain, brandishing a samurai sword, as well as troops that were about to be deployed that had come from below to join in the fray. It was Captain Bridson that decided to ram the sub, which initially didn't go down too well with the crew and the bridge, in view of the size-weight disparity of the respective combatants. This was the car equivalent of a Toyota Corolla ramming into a Range Rover. An enticement of a week's leave back home in New Zealand was made to the crew. That did the trick. At full speed, the Kiwi, guns blazing, struck the submarine port side behind the conning tower. In the ensuing close-quarter exchange, the captain and crew members manning the deck guns were largely wiped out. Bridson wasn't finished, went double or nothing. The nothing in this case meant a high probability of not seeing the sun rise in the morning. With a promise to double the leave in Auckland to 2 weeks, a second ramming attack was made. Due to the shallow waters, all her sister ship, the Moa, captained by Erskine Phelps, could do was largely confined to illuminating the fight. Amazingly, the only loss on board either the Kiwi or the Moa that evening was that of Dunedin signalman Campbell Buchanan. It was Buchanan that shone the Moa's searchlight and signal lamp onto the submarine, making him an obvious and clear target. Despite being hit, he bravely kept his post but died 2 days later. Buchanan was posthumously awarded the US Navy Cross. With Kiwi now crippled and limping away, it was now the turn of the Moa to attack and finally sink the submarine. Commanded by Captain Phelps, guns blazing, they too now attacked the stricken submarine as it retreated close to the shores it could get, upon which it ultimately became stranded on a reef. 27 of the crew were now either dead or missing, and the 66 survivors struggled to shore with the sub's most precious contents, the code books. Knowing all too well their importance, every effort was made to destroy all the books by either burning or burial. Something the US Navy that arrived on the scene the next day made them believe had happened. That's a real picture, by the way. Significant material was in fact retrieved from the submerged sub. Enough to once again be able to decipher Japanese encrypted messages. The most famous of these decryptions allowed the US to intercept and assassinate Japan's naval commander Admiral Yamamoto, the bloke behind the Pearl Harbor attack. The intelligence advantage of the reserve codebooks now being in Allied hands was immeasurable. At the beginning of the video I mentioned there were 3 bird-class vessels, the third being the Tui, who was also now in the Solomons. Amazingly, she also has her place cemented in naval history as well. The night after sinking the sub, the Tui met up with the Moa, and between them sunk 5 Japanese landing barges. Later that year, Tui was involved with the sinking of Japanese sub I-17, an infamous vessel, being the first Axis ship to shell US mainland in World War II. And what happened to the Moa and Kiwi for the rest of the war? Their fates were very different. On the 7th of April of the same year, Moa was refuelling in Tulagi Harbour in the Solomons, when she and other Allied vessels moored there were attacked by 98 Japanese aircraft. Struck by 2 bombs, she sank in less than 5 minutes. 2 US vessels also went to the bottom with her. 5 of the crew of the Moa were killed, and 7 seriously injured, including Captain Phelps. At the closing of this video, I will pay tribute to those sailors who paid their ultimate sacrifice serving their country. The Moa still sits at the bottom of the bay where she sank. Indeed, the resting places of both I-1 and Moa have become popular diving sites. Divers looking for the main gun on the submarine will be very disappointed though. That incredible piece of history is now on display in Auckland. The damaged Kiwi? Well, she limped home to Auckland for repairs. The crew got their promised leave. Later in the war, they got to march down Queen Street, lauded as heroes. Even if they still were in the dark as to their true contribution to the war efforts. Captain Bridson was also awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He added the medal to his collection. At the 1930 Empire Games, Bridson also won 2 silvers swimming for New Zealand. We are now at the end of this amazing true story. One I can never do true justice to. A story that should be taught in New Zealand schools. Made into a feature film. I hope you enjoyed this video and give it a like. And remember, they shall not grow old.